So last time I was lucky to be joined by both of you, Nicola and John, to talk about well blended fragrances and what that term means. And I think it kind of, if anything, illuminated the need for better language in perfume. And that kind of made me think about another thing that we have trouble often describing is an element of fragrance referring to its texture, or referring to something more than just the notes needed used in it, or the way it makes you feel when you wear it. But there's an element of its technicality, its construction, that refers to how it comes off. And I'm kind of curious to discuss this topic with both of you. So let's give you both a chance to introduce yourselves. Nicola, can we start with you?
Of course. So my name's Nicola Thomas. I write for Fragrantica, and I also write and produce the Sniff.
And I am John Biebel. I write for Fragrantica as well. And I do a couple of other things here and there in perfume as well.
A few things, yeah. Well, we'll more on that to come. But we're here to talk about texture in fragrance, and I always kind of wonder about that because it's not necessarily an element that I see in tons and tons of reviews of fragrance, even though I do think it's an element of a perfume, and often a very purposeful one given by a perfumer. So, when we think of ways to describe fragrance, we have, a few things to choose from. We have how it actually smells in terms of the notes. Is there an almond accord specifically, or is it an herbal perfume? Things that are broad categories or more specific notes. We have how it smells in terms of the emotions that it conjures. If it's a cheery fragrance, or if it's something a little bit more brooding or introspective, or even a turn on, right? We have how it behaves. Does it do something different in terms of smell and performance on skin versus on strip? Does it last all day, or does it is it a fleeting experience? But finally, its texture is really a very difficult thing to describe. And I'm just wondering if either of you have any initial thoughts to how we can describe a fragrance's texture and what that phrase actually means when we talk about all things olfactive.
I have a couple of broad thoughts about this, and I would say, first off, you're right to say this is difficult. I don't think we have a lot of language yet for it. And when I thought about this topic, my first inclination was to be really excited about it, which I am, but then also to be a little confused about, wow, this is more difficult than I thought it would be when it first came up. And so the next thought I had is that I think, in my mind at least, when I'm smelling, I can certainly kind of project myself into sort of, I guess you'd say, spaces, right, which would be almost three-dimensional or even architectural and things like that. So that might get into visual mixed with some sensory items or some time. But I think the texture kind of, for me, gets a little bit mixed into that idea of something that's a space. That's at least in some cases. And then in other cases, I was thinking, well, can I reduce that more to just sort of textural elements as a sort of a way to perceive? And it really challenged me to look quite differently at some things. And I was poking around a lot through samples and bottles that I had, and it came up with a couple of ideas, of things that I think had either deliberate or what I perceived to be very specific kinds of textures. But it did really force me to make a very different shift in my head of how I perceive these things.
When I was thinking about it, it came to me that certain textures are easier to identify than others. For example, powdery. I think we can see powdery quite easily, and people construct powdery accords, and iris often has that powdery facet in there somewhere. So I think of all the textures, that's an easier one to identify and might be a good place for people to start if they want to explore this topic. So I started by thinking, well, okay, what perfumes do I have that I think have interesting powdery facets to them, and what makes them special? And then I wanted to go a little bit further, and I wanted to find a scent that was like the opposite of that and that smelled shiny. hard and shiny and sleek. And I found that much, much harder to do. And some scents have that quality, and some of them have, for example, I thought of one fragrance which has a lot of citrus and leather, that I think has a kind of quite hard, shiny quality to it. But another citrus fragrance might not have that same, it will have ingredients in common, but it might not have that same quality. So I think it's kind of contextually really quite important as well, and which way the perfumer has tried to kind of push the perfume. Are they wanting to play up those hard, shiny elements, or are they going to want to soften it off and make it, a little bit easier? And then I guess the final thought I wanted to say by way of this introduction is that I've got synesthesia. So when I smell fragrances, I see images and colours, and predominantly colours, but quite often texture comes into that as well. So the fragrance that I've picked as my kind of shiny example, I don't know if it smells shiny to other people or if it's just my synesthesia that it smells shiny to. So I think that'd be quite fun if you guys have smelt it, so you can let me know a little bit later on.
Yeah, absolutely. Will do. And you were talking about powdery scents for a moment there, Nicola, and that kind of made me think that, initially when we first start thinking about this topic of texture and fragrance, it makes me wonder if, fragrance as a medium has a limited span of textures that can be created. And I say that because when I think of setting powdery fragrances on a spectrum, I would think that it would be the extreme foil to fragrances that have very light, airy, metallic even textures. I would think that those would be on a diametrically opposing sides of a scale, if you will. But then I think a little bit more critically about that thought, and I don't know if that's exactly true, because even in the powdery terminology that you use, there are different kinds of powdery scents. There are cosmetic powder, which can be achieved through aldehydes, through, iris materials. It can be achieved in many different ways. And then there are scents that are a bit lighter in texture than a cosmetic powder, something even more airy and aerated, I should say. And then there are, powdery scents that are, huge, rooty, orris-rich, like orris butter bombs, essentially. And so when I think about powdery, it sort of sets the example that we don't have necessarily a singular scale to judge textures on. And I don't know if the amount of texture that there is in perfume available based on materials that are commonly used in it is limited, or if it's actually quite broad. Because like you said, maybe somebody who thinks of something as shiny, another person might think of that as metallic, and another person might think of that as maybe even rooty in some respects. So it's a really difficult thing to describe, and it's difficult to tell when it is subjective versus objective. I think it's strange that it is, because we have the science to determine what most of the aroma chemical, naturally occurring aroma chemicals or synthetics are in a fragrance. We can reverse engineer something with a type of analysis that determines what is actually in it and what might cause those smells. But because of your synesthesia, because of the overall subjectiveness of how we smell it, it makes it all the more difficult to actually lay claim to a description, which I think is both a frustrating and a fascinating thing about appreciating perfumes in general. But I will say another kind of, difficult thing about this is that when you think about fragrance texture, it forces you to think about what items outside of the olfactive world might best relate to what you're smelling. So if I say that a fragrance is buttery, we don't really have many anchors to describe something as rich as butter. It's just sort of butter. It's lactonic and rich and maybe a little salty. And once you get past that, it's sort of difficult to describe butter. I think.
Yeah, and then also too, I wonder, does that necessarily convert to texture, right? Because does that necessarily mean like literally the greasy sensation of butter on your hands, or because I always think of texture as a tactile thing, right? In something that we perceive in through the sense of touch. But is it? Is it something that we see? Like if I look at a craggy rockscape or something like that, I can make assumptions about that texture without necessarily feeling it, right? I can visually kind of fill in the gap of what that texture is just by looking at it, right? So, on the one hand, you could say that texture of that buttery smell could be very fatty and lush, and that could be a very sort of positive feeling. But on the other hand, I might be thinking far too literally that it's disgusting, it's greasy and horrible, and I want to wash it off. So that also raises that interesting point of like, how do we perceive texture, right? And yeah,
And there are definitely some perfumes that you smell and the texture, you experience that texture, even though, like you say, normally you experience texture through your fingertips, for example, but you smell the perfume and it's like it fires the same synapses. So you kind of, it's almost like you've touched it, because you get that, it's like almost like a really visceral response. You think, oh, that's really, and fig is a material that quite often does that for me. Because if you imagine the way that the fig fruit feels, that kind of glaucous, slightly velvety texture, when I that have that, I can feel it. I can feel that kind of furriness, sort of slightly dry, slightly velvety, and it's really interesting because it is like it fires those synapses that you would normally be firing by touching the fig. I think that's really clever.
And I wonder too, when we smell that, is it because we already know, like, we already know what a fig smells like, or we already think we know what a fig smells like? And so do we experience that texture because we are familiar with the physical thing that it's referencing, or do we experience that texture as a result of what's actually in the bottle that you're spraying now? And it's really an interesting thing to think about. Um, we are not scientists, so we can't quite answer that, but I'm not so sure that there is a precise answer for this in science. Grant you, maybe this isn't high on the priority list for for science to figure out.
Interesting data I wanted to bring up here in this conversation that might be helpful, and that was when I was much earlier on. I was doing some articles for Fragrantica about color and scent, and I chose to do one about the concept of the color of gold, which is always tricky because it's usually perceived as a metallic thing. And so I tried to find out some data about, well, how do we perceive metallic colors? And there'd been an interesting study done with very, very young children, like taught like under the age of 1, and their attachment, or I'm sorry, their how much they were drawn to things that were either sort of yellow colored or those things that were literally metallic and shiny. And unquestionably, children were much more drawn to shiny things than to flat colored things. And the data just proved it out. And I was kind of wondered what we could sort of draw from that. I mean, it is funny because they say this about birds as well too, right? And they don't really draw conclusions from it, but it did strike me, that we do probably have some ingrained, just like base level reactions to certain textures or things, which are probably, wow, based on very sort of lizard brain, like that's a good texture, that's a bad texture, that's a complex texture because it's a mixture of things, right? Just something I wanted to throw out there to kind of,
It is a bit humbling that so much of our appreciation surrounding fragrance has to do with the lizard brain, as you put it. And we would love to think of ourselves as highly developed noses, but we're really, this is all having to do with something that's really quite evolutionary. So it's interesting.
But isn't that one of the most amazing things about fragrance, though, is that in order to produce and replicate fragrance and scale it to mass market, we have to be at the pinnacle of scientific advancement, you know, to kind of to do that stuff, to kind of extract the raw material and make it smell consistent batch after batch after batch. There's got to be a really high level of technical scientific know-how there, but we're doing that in order to feed the lizard brain. You know, it's kind of, it's the two ends of the spectrum. It's the very high to feed the very kind of base. And I think that's really cool. I think that's one of the exciting things about it.
I think it is important now to just sort of illustrate our points here. We could go back and forth for, you know, at length to philosophically depict what we're talking about. So let's give some examples that are, you know, a little bit more attainable for those who are listening. Nicola, I'd be really curious to start with you. And if you don't mind sharing about, you know, how your synesthesia plays into, you know, your perception of the fragrance, that'd be really fascinating, as well as your thoughts on its texture.
Okay. So the synesthesia is very delicate. And for me, I think for some people it can be quite strong, and it can, you know, kind of interfere with their lives quite a lot. But for me, it's quite delicate. So if you gave me a fragrance in a banana-shaped bottle with a bright yellow label on it, that would kind of override, you know, and, you know, then a really strong banana accord. The yellowness of the banana would be, that visualness of it would override the synesthesia. So I might not get a sort of a particular synesthesic response from it. So it's one of the reasons I like to smell things blind, actually, initially, because it allows it to happen and to kind of spark without without the kind of visual, because we're so we're vision dominant creatures. If you take that out of the equation to the extent that you can, it allows the synesthesia to kind of play. So the thing that I've picked that I think smells shiny is Bois de Ré by Van Cleef & Arpels. And there's something about this which, I mean, it's a vanilla dominant fragrance. But there's something about it that when I inhale it, it's almost like the bit of my brain that's looking for patterns and looking for notes and looking for familiarity kind of slides off it, and it just goes whoop instead of sticking with anything. It just goes whoop, and I get this real. I mean, I've actually drawn this. Actually, I'm not going to show you because I'm not very good at art. But the drawing is like, it's a sphere with and it's silvery. It's like a silver moon, but instead of being created like a moon is, it's completely smooth, and then it kind of drips like kind of a nectarous kind of honey type substance. And that's what I get when I smell this fragrance. It makes me sound completely bonkers.
When you far worse.
Leaderless moon, is that what you were going to say, basically?
Yeah. You know, when you try and describe a synesthetic response to something, it does make you sound like you're absolutely nuts. But that's what I get, and it's really strange. And I don't know, have either of you smelled this fragrance? Do you?
I have not smelled it. I mean, this isn't. I am really interested to smell it now, of course, because this is fascinating.
No, I can't say I have either. Although I could say the same about any of that brand's fragrances. It's something that I've woefully been, you know, inexperienced with.
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, I looked up the notes, and they're nothing that strikes me as being particularly shiny. It's mineral notes, which I guess could be a little bit black pepper, vanilla, almonds, tobacco, cedar, tonka bean, teak, and musk. So there's nothing particularly metallic in there that you might get that shininess from. But to me, yeah, it just something about it. It just is smooth, and it's really smooth, and yeah, kind of shiny.
And that your brain kind of created a narrative where you had said that the drawing that you made of this had a flowing or a dripping element, something akin to a liquid or maybe a syrup.
Yeah.
Interesting that your brain created that kind of narrative surrounding it too, because it's like, what about those materials makes me think of anything remotely wet or able to drip? Fascinating, fascinating stuff.
Yeah, that almost
Yeah.
implies like something being slick, you know, like wet slick or something, or like with I don't know, like, yeah, I don't know. I'm just fascinated by the idea of something so slick that it's literally dripping off the sides. That's wild. Like a
Yes.
candy apple,
Yeah.
you know, or something.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that's it. And it's almost like a way of making it slicker, you know, so it just being a shiny moon isn't enough. It has to have this coating to make it more lubricated and more slick. So yeah.
Sort of dipping it in a
Yeah.
wax preserving coating or something. Like, wow, that's wild.
Yeah.
That's
So
awesome.
Now that is
yeah, it's
something that
a little bit.
we'll have to be mindful of the accords that we're sharing about the fragrances that we're talking about today, because perhaps there
Yeah.
is something, that they might share in common. Maybe there isn't, but it'd be interesting to see if there is. So can you just again share the accords listed in this fragrance here?
Yeah. So they are mineral notes, black pepper, vanilla, almond, tobacco and cedar, and then tonka bean, teak wood and musk.
Mineral notes and black pepper combining, to me, imagining the way that smells, because I also really like a lot of, like you, Nicola, I share a fascination for scents with the mineralic quality. And black pepper is always something that I try to seek out as often as possible, just because I, love eating it and I love smelling it. But I can imagine that those two notes, in particular, combining in a way that might lend an almost luminescent quality to a fragrance. And when I say luminescent, I sort of see that as a shiny object in my mind's eye. So that's interesting. So it's good that we're repeating these accords so that maybe we can see if there's anything in common with what we're talking about today. How about you, John? Do you have an example of something particularly textural?
Yeah. So I also was thinking, I found that texturally, I was kind of looking for some extremes. Although, part of my head was thinking too that it'd be interesting to look at some, perfumes that had sort of more delicate textures or something. But one, that intrigues me a lot because I think it has a lot of texture is Yves Saint Laurent's Kouros, which, and when I try to, this is a pretty hard fragrance to actually say, oh, it has this one distinct texture. I mean, it's first of all, it's huge. And I think that the scale of a fragrance, like its sillage and all that, has a lot to do with texture for some reason for me. And this thing is so loud and so kind of voluminous in like a cloud way, like this big old cloud. So that's like one predominant texture right off, is that it's this sort of loud, I was going to say loud cloud, but it is a loud cloud of fragrance. And it's got that sort of very characteristic, very animalic mixed with stuff. I mean, there's a big civet note. There's a lot of clary sage in here, so it has that very characteristic kind of animalic men's fragrance. I mean, this sort of set the stage for a lot of other, perfumes like it. But there's a kind of, and of course, it's very mossy as well too. And so, anytime that there's moss mixed with that sort of, kind of slightly wet, cloudy condensation kind of something, I automatically think of that texture of just something that's organic and crawling on the ground. So like literally moss, not so much like, oak moss in the trees or something like that, but, kind of moss growing on a rock or moss growing against tree bark or something like that, up the side of a tree. And to me, that it has that sort of, it isn't a smooth or a rough texture. It's that sort of, gosh, what do you call that texture? It's that kind of bristly. It is soft. It is soft, but it's that bristly, a little bit more textures than something like flocking, the way that which I actually have to say I hate the texture of flocking. You know, there's some perfume companies that flock their bottles, which gives me like, oh, gets me there. It's like sorry, nails on a chalkboard for me. But so I think it's actually the contrast of textures in Kouros that's so remarkable, because it does have this big halo in a sense of a cloud, and then this kind of creeping moss, and you know, much more kind of earth level texture going on, and they operate at the same time, which is what makes it so remarkable in a way. You know, is this mixture of these two different textures for me. And one of them is a lot more tactile, and one of them is very like in space. And I've never felt a cloud, so I'm just imagining that it's soft and moist, and so one is real and one is more imagined too, I think.
It is interesting that in both of your descriptions thus far, you have words that refer to more conceptual descriptions. It's like a cloud, for example, even though none of us have felt a cloud or held one, or even if that would be particularly possible, right? We can run our hand through one, but and then you have interspersed those more conceptual things with more down to earth, like this is the note that's coming through and causing that texture. So it does make me think of like, well, are textures in perfumes caused by specific materials and notes, or are they caused by the combination they're in, or is it kind of both? It's really hard to tell, but especially in something as a formula as seemingly complex as Kouros.
It's a great point, and I think I may be oversimplifying and thinking, oh, this sort of equates that, or this equates that, and I agree that there's probably a lot of complexity that adds to those sensations. But I do wonder too if there are some particular notes, like sort of when you were talking about the complexity of iris and all the different sort of ways you can view it. There's something about clary sage, I have to say, that's a real. It's an odd note, and it will often lead though down very specific paths for me. It's not used as much as people think in perfumery. Like it's not in everything the way that like amber is, right? And it does. It leads to very specific feelings, sensations, like profiles, and in this case, I think textures too. I may be taking a bit of a leap there, but I'm okay with that leap in this case.
Clary sage is one of my favorite materials, so I'm okay with that leap too, John. It really is, I agree. Yeah. It's I always think of it as Iris's more brooding cousin.
Yeah, very good point. Yeah, because it's almost ridiculously optimistic. It's sort of like the Odie from Garfield. Kind of just. I don't mean to give a disservice, but it always struck me as very optimistic in its smell.
And I'm going to be thinking of Odie next time I smell Kouros. That's a very strange mishmash of.
No, completely bad coupling of things. Yeah, but what about you, Adam? What have you got for us next?
Okay, so I don't know why. Maybe it's just because I have you here and you can add perspective to it. But I seem to have this habit of bringing up something that you've made, John, when you're here. But honest to goodness, I chose this mostly just because, there is something that's very textural about it. It's Orla from January Sun Project. John is the perfumer and creator of that house and this fragrance. And I'm just wondering, John, if you will forgive me, first of all, bringing this up. I don't want to put you on the spot, but for me, Orla is very much a perfume of texture because it gives off, using aldehydes at the start mixed with something a bit sweeter in the base. It gives off this idea, and something milky in it too. It gives off this idea of like that steam texture. If you've ever put your face over a rapidly boiling pot, hopefully not for very long, you get that. It almost has a very instantly suffocating feel, but not in a bad way. It's just sort of like the steam entering, your
Yeah.
nasal cavity a little bit, and you go, oh. It's that rush of fragrant things that are coming to temperature. That's just my interpretation of your thing. I'm wondering, when you were creating this, you obviously made decisions about the notes and about how those notes combine, but were you thinking at all about texture? And does texture play into your work in general when you're blending anything?
Yeah, a really cool question, and it's kind of fun to be able to answer. I know that there were two things that relate directly to what you were mentioning, and one of them was that I had this idea of there being a milkiness to it, but for whatever reasons brought me there, I decided that this had to be a very specific, like, cooked milk accord, and that not only, like, undergoes like a certain chemical process. If milk gets heated, right, it starts to caramelize the milk, and so that happens, but there's always a lot of steam when that happens as well. So I sort of knew that that sensation of, you know putting one's face into that steam was going to be part of what I ended up with. The bigger task, though, just from a technical point of view, was to create, like, because that meant a sort of a burst of there had to be sort of a burst of smell in order to bring that about, because I don't think a skin scent would affect that same notion of something that's like steamy or cooking. Like, it literally has to kind of rise. And so it was funny because I found myself researching a lot of the, like, bigger old school, predominantly women's fragrances that have that sort of really big initial push in the beginning, and what creates that sort of loud kind of burst, if you will. And so in the process of doing that technical exercise, I found out that there was a lot of texture that came with it. And so it may not have been so intentional, but I was really happy with the effect that was created by it, which, I'm not sure if I feel pretty good about that, though. I think that was actually a good way to get toward a texture. I think it's kind of a valid, you have a different, you reach a certain point with maybe a slightly different means in the beginning, but it also helped to just let a couple of the floral elements, like, just have a bit more space, and and sort of get more aspirated, if you will, than they may have before. But
It seems like aldehydes were a very important part of that process. And I certainly
yeah,
wouldn't be the first person to bring that up in reference to Orla, but I'm curious to know, what your thoughts are about that material specifically, because they can be quite alien in comparison to other materials that are meant to mimic something found in nature, like a woody material, or an
yeah, they
herbal
are, and
material.
that's what I think. The two thoughts I had about that quickly were just that I do think they are best utilized for their sort of, I guess, really it's textural impact as opposed to their smell. I do think they have interesting smells, some of them, but then also what I also found is really important is combining certain aldehydes together, because I generally have worked with just kind of one aldehyde for one effect in an area, but then I noticed there is some weird synergies that happen when you mix two aldehydes together, for example, or even three. I probably wouldn't go beyond three. Then you get into, like, just this mess of I don't know, weird, like, champagne, Coca-Cola, peach, coconut kind of mishmash of stuff. But mixing certain aldehydes together in at slightly different proportions to see what impact you get was really, really interesting process to go. But it does create a very interesting effect. And I do agree. I love the fact that they don't have a distinct, no, this is what's even more interesting. When most people are asked about, well, what do aldehydes make you think of, they always mention other sort of man-made things, not anything in nature. They always mention, like, oh, it makes me think of champagne, or which I love. I love that it's kind of remains in this kind of very very 20th century sort of reference point, which is pretty cool in a way. It's otherworldly in that sense. Yeah.
So how about either of you? Do you have another example to bring to the table here?
So this is the one that I picked that's like the opposite of Bois de Ré, to me at least. And this is L'Eau Diva by Frederic Malle. And
Very fun.
this is such a good fragrance.
Yeah. Yeah.
It basically has, if you imagine going out on a cold winter's evening but being wrapped up, and it starts snowing and there's the really big fat snowflakes, and if you just turn your face up to the sky and let a couple settle on your face, it has that texture. It has that kind of feathery. I mean, yes, it's cool and quite, in temperature, it's quite a cool perfume, but it has that. It's not. It is powdery, but it's powdery in the specific way that powdery relates to snow, rather than it being powdery as like face powder or any other sort of powder. It's a specifically snow powderiness. And I think that's amazing. The fact that the perfume is able to convey that sense of snow powder in a fragrance, that it just boggles my mind, and it's really good. It's a really good scent. Yeah, it has that featheriness about it, which without being animalic, without it smelling of birds, it has that featheriness.
Yeah,
it's just remarkable.
This description is making me think of I don't know if you know the Scottish band Las Vegas, and they wrote a Christmas album, and one of their songs, which I just looked up again because I want to remember the title exactly. It's such a beautiful title. A snowflake fell and it felt like a kiss. Which it just sounds exactly what you're describing, especially those fat snowflakes, because they fall really, it feels like they fall in this almost like, like a leaf falling slow kind of way, but
yeah. And so the notes that are listed for this are heliotrope, iris, white musk, angelica, honey, bergamot, and jasmine, which when you read those notes, I don't think you would necessarily imagine that the fragrance would smell the way that it does. And I can't see anything in there which has in like kind of it. So I know that the powderiness is coming from the iris and possibly the heliotrope as well, and there's other elements that are adding that. But I've smelt lots of perfumes that have got iris in that don't smell like snow, and I've smelt lots of perfumes that have got heliotrope in that don't have that lightness, that kind of ethereal quality, that featheriness. And so it must be about the notes, but it also must be about the context. The accords and the context. I don't think it can just be one. But I also, the more we talk about it, the more I think being able to manipulate the sense of texture, it must be like, kind of god level perfumery. It's not just tinkering about in your bedroom level perfumery. Being able to evoke a specific texture, and particularly to this sort of level, that must be some pretty clever people doing that, because I don't think it's something that you would be able to happen upon. I don't think you could really do it as a happy accident and get that lightness and that airiness and that kind of coolness all at once. I just think that perfume's a triumph, really. I think it's really clever because it's fun to wear and it has a great texture and it does what it says it's going to so successfully, and with a very light touch as well. So yeah, I think that's a really cool one.
Well, something that we're maybe a little bit numb to as fragrance fans and thinkers and writers is that, when we see a brand that advertises, oh, this smells like a crystalline vase on an old shelf, and story is important. I prefer a brand to provide some kind of context for where they're setting their creation in, but we're all a little bit used to reading these things and kind of a little bit going like internally, oh yeah, okay, let's see how this goes. So I think it's all the more important, to your point, Nicola, to celebrate fragrances that are able to utilize notes, utilize texture, and utilize that storytelling capability that those qualities bring, to actually do what it says on the tin. John, do you have another example?
Yeah, I agree with what you were just saying, Adam, because I feel like it's certainly one thing to, and I don't actually even have a problem with marketers wanting to kind of push a notion of a fragrance going a certain way, but it is weird if you feel like it becomes really dissonant, where you're sort of being led one way through some copy, but at the same time you are experiencing something a different way, and you are almost even wondering like, am I experiencing this right? Is this correct? Which is, of course you can enjoy it any way you want, but it does feel weird, sometimes if you're the feeling for you is so absolutely different, and it does. I think there's a little bit of a sense of what can't quite describe exactly, but you can kind of put a nice check mark to something when you're like, okay, I think their intentions and my perception are kind of aligned, and it feels a little good, I think, when that matches up, because to your point, Nicola, then you feel like the vision was seen through, it really was like kind of master level, like they did this thing that they set out to do, and that feels good when that happens, I think.
It's almost like,
it's really satisfying.
Yeah.
It's almost as though, the more a brand decides to paint, the more detailed a painting, so to speak, that they paint with words in their marketing message, the more of a risk they're taking, because the more details that they're trying to invoke here in their copy, the more chances, I think, for subjective smellers to maybe have a very different experience with it. To that extent, though, I think texture is all the more important to think about and to perhaps aim for perfumers who are making things, because even if your marketing copy doesn't exactly line up with everybody's experience with something that a house is releasing, texture in fragrance has that capability to kind of bridge the gap and give more visceral responses to perfumes, I think. When I smell something that, makes my hair stand on end, even if that's not a good thing, I have to say, oh, well, they definitely accomplished something here, right? And so, yeah, that's just interesting to me. John, what is your next example for a textural fragrance?
Sure, I'm torn between a couple, so I may do like some very short, references to a couple things here. But there was one that stuck out to me by a house I really like in there. I think they're a little under the radar, but it's one of the few, it may be the only house that exists in Bermuda. This is Lily Bermuda, and the really great perfume house. They do tend to do things that are sort of the place, like it's they're sort of summery and sort of coastal type of fragrances. So this is one called Southwater, and it has a such an interesting thing to smell, because it's a real mixture. It's what the primary subject texture I want to describe here is it's going to sound really odd, but it has a sharpness to it, and sharp I mean really textural, like almost like sharp ridges, not an unpleasant feeling at all. So it's sort of that, along with kind of the smooth, if you can imagine smooth and sharp mixed together. So what is that? It's like when you're running your hand on something that has little bumps and it feels really nice, sort of like in a massaging kind of way. So that is a texture that I'm very interested in fragrance, where it's sort of like little blips or bumps along what is, though, however, a fairly smooth and not too crazily varying landscape. So there's probably one good word that would summarize all that. So I challenge both of you to help me with that one word. But so there's enough texture to notice differentiation, but not so much that it's like complete peaks and valleys.
Oh, I think I've risen to the challenge.
Okay,
variegated.
Yeah, variegated is probably pretty good, right? Because it's still even within like for the visual version of that, even within like a variegated leaf, right, which is what I think of, you're still within a somewhat good range of color values, right, or something that are related, right? So it is, they're still of a certain thing, but not too crazily out there. And that's what I find here, between what is like, there's coconut in here, plus some C notes and some very light musk. And I believe I'm going to do a quick look here on what else is in here. There is a sharp note as well, and it's a fruit note, I believe. Yeah, in this case it's guava, which is pretty interesting because guava is an unusual smell. I've always found guava to have a kind of a almost a slightly animalic smell to it. And there's also mimosa, which is to me very textural. Like that's a very buzzy, fuzzy smell. Mimosa is. But I love the idea that this is all within an otherwise pretty beachy, coconutty, you know, which for me are just very smooth, very just like lotiony kind of, you know, smells. And yet this still has those little bits of spikes in there, which is just pretty fascinating for texture. So that's one I wanted to bring up. And it's the second one quickly I wanted to raise too, which is very different and is far smoother, but pretty well known. And this is Guerlain's vetiver, which, you know, I think this is a lot of people, you know, are maybe familiar with this, or it certainly has that sort of classic status of, and what I think I actually reach for this for its texture more than anything. This is to me has a kind of strange predictability in that it's very linear. Like I don't find this episodic at all. It's just that one smell and you get it and it fades out, that same smell. And it isn't, you know, actually I gotta say it's a little bit similar to soft water, but it is even less differentiation between those spikes. So it's even down to just a bare hum. So it's not just flat smooth. It's not like what Nicola was describing, where it's like totally shiny, like things you could go ting ting like that. This is smooth, but smooth the way that suede, really closely cropped suede would be smooth. Like smooth, but just a little bit enough that it would stop your hand from moving. You know what I'm saying? Like that kind of, like if it might stop your hand if you weren't moving fast enough across the surface. So smooth to the touch, but it still has some nap, if you will.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's interesting. It's
Yeah.
like close crop velvet, possibly.
It is really interesting that, because I have a similar experience with vetiver dominant scents, and I know the scent. I know the Guerlain one, and yeah, I can understand exactly what you're talking about. The way I conceptualize it is, it is that close cropness and that nap. But for me, it's like, you know, if you get a blade of grass and it quite often has little tiny microscopic hairs on it, and if you rub it one way, the grass feels smooth, and if you try and rub it the other, it's sort of slightly sticky. And sticky's not the right word, but yeah, like shorn velvet. And that's where I go to with vetiver scents. It's where I go to with that one, and it's also where I go to with D600 by Carner Barcelona. It has that. It's almost like your nose feels the texture like your finger would. And I just think that maybe that is something to do with the material then, because if we're having a similar response to vetiver, but it's fascinating. It's such an interesting material, and it's such a, you know, when it is in these kind of higher concentrations, perhaps that's part of the magic of it, is making us feel like we're stroking velvet the wrong way.
There's something interesting what you just mentioned about the blade of grass, though, because what I like about that is it reminds me a little too of things like, you know, cobwebs or spider webs, and how they have that sort of inherent sort of stickiness, but it's very organic, right? It's this very organic, possibly even a defensive, you know, kind of part of the makeup of it or something, right? That I wonder that seems to have there's something interesting about that, you know, because you almost do react. I find there's a big push and pull for me in that texture. You know, it's a bit seductive. It's also a little bit something I want to avoid in some way because it feels like I'm not supposed to touch it. You know, that it's an interesting reaction I have to textures like that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I totally agree with you on that. I think it's really interesting to hear that verbalized from somebody else, because often I think we perceive some of these things very, you know, in isolation, because you don't always talk about it. You know, you don't often talk about, does this feel like Sean Velvet to you? So when somebody verbalizes it and it's to the experience that you have, it's really interesting.
It is, yeah. It is a little bit of healthy validation there, yeah. So, what about you, Adam? What else have you got there?
So I have a couple of examples about a type of texture in fragrance that I'm really fascinated by, and that is this idea of oiliness. And when I say it that way, I don't want to confuse it with motor oil or, you know, dark synthetic oils that we use to make machines run. I'm talking about almost like if you could picture olive oil being dripped into water and like having those hundreds of little droplets form, you know, resisting the cellular push of the water or pull of the water. It's that thickness, if you will, that oil has, whether it's an olive oil or a more natural oil, almost richness without being, you know, at all related to anything sugary or sweet, and nothing that has any butteriness to it either. It's its own kind of richness. This oily texture that I'm referring to, and it's something that I smell very much in, unfortunately now discontinued Seville. John, I'll let you French this.
Is it that's the Seville? Which one is it? The
Laube.
Oh yeah, Seville Laube. Right. Yeah.
Apologies. I do try with these things, fine. But you know, with this one, I didn't want to butcher it.
Seville Laube. Right. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
Give me a Spanish title sometime, please. I just, you know,
yeah, really.
I would have a much easier time with those. So no, Seville Laube, really fascinating perfume, because to me it is almost corn-like. And I say that because I think of when I smell it, and I don't mean to put anybody off on it, but it kind of reminds me of, you know, like corn oil grease, maybe like something that you would have as an extraction process when making corn oil, or something that might be a seeping out of something made with corn, like high quality, freshly milled corn flour, like a masa corn mixture. And something that's very common to, like, you know, Tex-Mex and you know, Southwestern cooking. Like almost like a corn chip quality to it. And I know that that's because Orange Blossom has these effects sometimes, and maybe that's just amplified for me. But when I smell it, I can't help but picture this lathered, oily texture. It's slick without being slippery, and it's rich without being buttery or sugary. And it's that oiliness, for lack of a better term, that kind of comes first to my mind. And I've smelled something similar in another perfume, a wildly different perfume in both notes and temperature, if you will. Maybe we'll have another episode where we talk about temperature in perfumes. Seems related. But Patchouli Intense from Parfums de Nicolai has a similar texture to my nose. It's very thick, almost like shaving cream, but with, well, it's no surprise I think of shaving cream because this has, you know, some notes in common with almost barbershop quality, but it's very lathered, it's very rich without being gourmand. And it's something that I kind of struggle to describe to people who haven't smelled them before. And so I'm kind of curious if either of you have ever smelled something that has that oily quality or oily texture without, you know, referring to something like motor oil.
One thing that interests me texturally is how something like alcohol, you know, or you know, ethanol or whatever on your skin it doesn't pool up at all the way that water does. And I think molecularly it immediately flattens out. And the thing about oil that's so interesting is that it really does pool a lot, like into almost a three-dimensional shape. If you pour it, it doesn't flatten until it gets really hot, and then it becomes like more of this really fast moving thing. So I think that oily thing for me is really textural more than, I think of it first texturally before smell, because I always sort of see it as a something very interesting in space, the way that it operates in terms of its viscosity in space, which is sort of intriguing. So do you think you attribute certain scents to that? Or is it that you kind of, or like, because I'm thinking of certain distillation process, stuff like that, like, are there certain, like, I could see how patchouli just, it's like that, it is a thick oil, right? And it's, I wonder if maybe, not that I'm saying, like, oh yeah, that's why, no, but, I wonder if one might make that kind of connection, or do you think it really is sort of just a disconnect? I don't know. I'm curious where
I'm getting it from, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's a good question. I have absolutely no idea because, well, because, I used to think that it might be related to notes. And when I said shaving cream, like related to the Parfums de Nicolai fragrance, that is probably because, there's lavender in, there's herbaceousness in it, and there's mossiness, and that combination of moss and herbs and something a little thicker in texture kind of gives off that shaving cream kind of vibe.
Right.
It doesn't smell like shaving cream, as it were. It's just it's a fragrance that has those rich qualities and that type of richness specifically. But I discovered the Patchouli Intense fragrance before I discovered the L'Artisan one, and I used to think, like what you were getting at, that it was just something to do with the notes. But these two fragrances, the L'Artisan and the Parfums de Nicolai, are wildly different in terms of their note makeup. They're just
right.
They share very little, if anything, in common.
Right.
And they don't. The only thing I think they have in common is the texture. When I really put my nose to it, when I really study them, the only thing I can kind of smell as a commonality between the two are the textural quality that I'm talking about today. So, I think it's more just the combination.
Yeah.
Just something in the combination. And to be fair, this is not it's not a fragrant texture that I smell often. It's quite rare for me. The only other thing I can think of off the top of my head that smells, oily, actually is another one of your creations, John, is Smolder Rose. Smolder Rose to me has that kind of like thickly laden, oily, slick smell. And I don't know if you can shed any light on whether or not you even agree with that. But I'm curious to know if that helps define it better.
No, when you first said one of yours, I was like kind of racing through my head. What's he talking about? Like, no, not that I mind that. But as soon as you started to say Smolder Rose, I'm like, oh yes, of course, right. So there's definitely it makes sense that you would say that. Yeah, absolutely. And I wouldn't say it was something that I specifically thought to do, but it absolutely makes sense that you reach that conclusion. And I would say, yeah, it has that characteristic to it. I'm not sure what would contribute to it specifically, but having
tough part
said that, I'm just thinking more about this whole notion of the kind of that oily sensation. There's an interesting sort of crossover here too, which I remember Sandrina had written an article about solar notes, which I thought was, I remember at the time thinking, this is interesting, but wow, we're getting abstract, right? Like what does that mean? And yet I knew that she was tapping into something interesting, because I always thought there was sort of a weird sort of smell associated with like just baking in the sun, not even taking away the sun cream, but being in intense heat and like the air and the temperature, and mix all that together. And yes, there's like a body of sort of smell associated with it. I wouldn't know how to pinpoint it, But I do remember if I kind of extended it a bit further and I started thinking about like things that grow in the sun, things that like produce essential oil, like in the oil extraction process, like it kind of did start to make a lot of sense to me. So not that I'm trying to make sense of what you're saying, but I do think there's something interesting about like this process of like, the oils like of things, of natural organic things being built up in these cell walls pretty much through photosynthesis. And then we, eventually extract them in some way that it's kind of interesting to then have that texture come out in certain fragrances later. It's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way of looking at it, John, because when Adam, when you started talking about oily, I sort of, searched my mental database of fragrances and thought the one that I came up with was Affecting Mind by Mint. They're kind of a not very well talked about niche brand, but that's a very nutty fragrance, but the nuts feel like they've been kind of compressed, so there's an oiliness to it as well. You almost get that sense of like some sort of hazelnut oil perhaps being in there. And why does it smell oily as opposed to hazelnutty? I can't really say, apart from it does. That
Right.
it kind of, when you smell it, you get that sense of oiliness. It's really interesting. But I guess I kind of like the way that John, you tied that all together quite neatly by saying, it's grown in these cell walls and then we extract it. It kind of almost brings us full circle in a way to that idea of oiliness as being manufactured, but from something natural. And it's a really interesting facet to fragrance, that.
Nicola, what was the name of the perfume from Mint you just mentioned?
Affecting Mind.
Okay, because this is a brand I was interested in. Yeah, they have those interesting black bottles, right? Is that them?
Yeah, the bottles are lovely. They've got a kind of like knitted
Yeah.
texture bottle.
I remember seeing them and thinking, God, this is strange. Like very like almost something cool, but made through an uncool means. Like by having these sort of knitted sleeves sort of tucked around them, and it was like interesting, kind of. Yeah, I thought that was pretty.
Yeah.
Cool.
It reminds me of like a canteen that you might see strapped onto an adventurer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're pretty cool looking, yeah, but still very sleek, and that's textural too, isn't it? Really, like very textural.
It is textural too. Yeah. They're quite, when you pick them up, they are quite tactile. You do sort of want to feel the bottles. They've got that kind of little, like very fine knit, but yeah, they feel nice in your hand.
That's cool.
Something that I'm hearing in our discussions today about texture and fragrance is, we're really, maybe more so than previous conversations we've had, we are really straddling the line between something that we can pinpoint for specific reasons, an effect of a fragrance having a specific reason for that effect, versus something that's much more abstract and much less easy to place. And it makes me wonder if it might be worth finding an olfactive scientist to speak with on Fragrantica Talks episode in the future. We've been talking about texture, and we've been talking a little bit. We've made some references today about fragrance temperature, and something, a fragrance can be cool or warm. And I'm curious to know, maybe at some point after we have maybe one or two more discussions that are generalized like this about an aspect of fragrance, maybe it might be useful to kind of bring in somebody who might be able to shed some light on any possible scientific theories as to why these things occur. I'm not sure, it's hard to talk about these things so abstractly, because I worry that it makes us, delve too deeply into the land of the subjective. But at the same time, it's also difficult to talk about these things in an overly scientific way. And at some point, I think doing so might even defeat the purpose. So, fragrance lies in between two real extremes. And I'm curious to know if either of you have any frustrations when you're trying to discuss any aspect, whether it's texture, whether it's notes, whether it's even temperature. Either of you have anything that particularly frustrates you when you're trying to communicate it in your writing or even just in your chats?
It's a constant frustration. But that's the beauty of it. I think one of the reasons I like writing about fragrance so much is that it makes my brain itch. In my day job, I'll be writing an email about something. I don't even really have to turn my brain on to try and describe a particular nuanced response to a niche fragrance. Makes my brain itch. It makes my brain go, "Oh, are you going to make me do that again?" And it fires parts of my brain that I don't otherwise exercise very often. And that process can be deeply rewarding, but it can be deeply frustrating as well. I guess as a consumer of fragrant content, I find it really frustrating when people reference perfumes that I haven't smelled. And like, this is like, it smells like a 1982 version of Poison, and I think, well, I haven't smelt that. And so for me, I think the battle is
and you've smelled a
always
lot
going
of
to be
things, right?
between.
Yeah, you're not very serious about this, are you?
Yeah.
But no, so
Fragrance benchmark setting is in and of itself tremendously frustrating. I agree with you.
yeah, but yeah. So there's always going to be that fight between accuracy and accurately describing how a scent smells or makes you feel, or both, and accessibility. Because I really passionately believe that fragrance shouldn't be for people who have a specific set of reference points from a specific culture, from a specific income bracket. It should be something that people across the board can pick up and understand. And I feel quite strongly that it's our job as fragrance communicators to hit that sweet spot between accurately portraying the scent, but doing so in a way that's accessible to people, so that somebody, I have people from all over the world read my stuff, and I want to be able to touch the life of somebody who lives in a completely different part of the world to me. I want them to read one of my reviews and think, I've got a sense of whether I might like that perfume. Maybe I'll hunt it out. And I think that's where the frustration with there not being enough words for fragrance, and there aren't enough, there isn't like a kind of fragrant lingua franca that we all share. And there are a lot of the words that we use to describe fragrance quite often relate to things in our specific environment, like temperature, or things that are specific to our own particular cultures. And so it's trying to communicate adequately without excluding people. And that it's a huge fragrance. It's a huge frustration for me, but it's also what makes it really exciting and really engaging, and an intellectual activity as well as a hobby, and just something that we all do because we're compelled to.
That's a really great description, and I agree with with what you just said about it, how it forces your brain to think very differently and work harder in a way. That's what I always think of, as it makes my brain work harder. The other thing I was going to mention, Adam, is it's interesting to talk about something like texture, because that's another way of chipping away at this problem, if you will, of the dilemma of how do we talk about these things. It's like, well, how else can we sort of slice the same cake, if you will, because if we slice it this way, we might see something else. And so talking about texture or color or temperature or place and time, things in certain decades or materials, all of these different ways of looking at it are all pretty valuable in their own way, because they give us another access to a whole other world of vocabulary that we might not use, or new ways to talk about something that might spark interest or a kind of kinship with someone else who may say, okay, now I know what you're talking about. Maybe before I didn't. Now you're speaking my language and I understand. Because I think that point that Nicola, you just made about a lingua franca. We don't really have one. We occasionally reach certain words or phrases that come close, but I feel like when we do, they rapidly lose their meaning. You know, like, you know, when we you know, it's just these buzzwords that come up, and then like within a year, people are already getting tired of hearing them. You know, so or we start to rely on them too easily in writing, and they don't really have a lot of import or meaning anymore. So yeah, I think we're doing better by having discussions like this, by slicing at things differently. Well, I think that may wrap up our discussion. Adam, what else do you think you'd like to tell our listeners, readers, participants out there?
Well, so yeah, I do really want anybody who's watched to the end here to share, if they're so willing, some fragrances that they think have specific textures, and their thoughts on that topic, and maybe, you know, we can use that information for a follow-up in the future. You know, if we have a few people who are saying, you know, XYZ fragrance smells like this, then that'd be some great fodder for some future discussions. And we'd really love to have that kind of interaction with everyone who has some keen thoughts on this topic. I feel like it's a very personal thing for everyone, given the wide range of textures that we brought up and the wide range of perfumes that we brought today to our discussion. I'd be really interested to see what our listeners and Fragranticans also think about the same topic. So thank you everyone for your time.